There it is. Y'all see it? Top left corner. Okay. All right. We have our class is May the 9th. And so that means we got 4 weeks left, 4 times left. We're going to look, and we have looked at this a little bit, about the year, the month, the week, and the day. And, this Friday is what they call Good Friday, and then Sunday is what they say when Jesus was resurrected from the dead. There's discussions in reference to that. And since we're studying the manner and so forth, the customs, I didn't know whether it would benefit y'all if we were to maybe discuss how that some of that issue is in reference to when did Jesus die, and to just say what I believe the Bible teaches is like on Friday, Jesus died at 3 p.m., and that's Friday daytime. No, we're talking about Jewish time. So that's one day, even though it's not a 24-hour day. And so he died, and he was buried before the Sabbath. And so he was in the grave on the Sabbath. That was Friday night, Saturday night. And then he was in the grave Saturday night to Sunday morning. And so that would be 3 days and 3 nights. Now, it doesn't mean that there was 12-hour days and 12-hour nights. In other words, 36 daytime and 36 nighttime. But some people try to say it's Thursday, and some people say it's Wednesday. And I even heard some say all back Tuesday. But there's no way that a person can get 72 hours. Because remember, Jesus died at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and so for it to be exactly 72 hours, he'd have to be raised from the dead on Sunday at 3 p.m. So if y'all would like to do that, you need to let me know, and we'll talk about that, and just because again, it's using some of the things that we've already learned. Okay, if you're interested in that, you let me know. Okay, let's have a word of prayer. Well, again, we're thankful for the day, for the blessings of life. We're thankful that we can come together as thy children, and by the means that we come together and that we study thy word, and may the things, Father, we learn will be the things that will help us to be able to teach others. And also, Father, help us to have a better understanding of thy word. We pray, Father, for the church throughout the world. We're thankful for each congregation of thy people. We pray, Father, we'll all strive to be of the same mind and same judgment, that we carry out thy work of edifying, building up the church, evangelizing our world, helping those who are in need. We pray, Father, for those who are sick, and those who have asked interest in our prayers on their behalf. We pray, Father, all things be well with them. Pray that thou would forgive us in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, let's talk about travel, and Jim and I were talking. For some of y'all, Brother Hornback is retiring this month, and so from junior ROTC. And he's already retired from the United States Army, and he was the first sergeant. That's what we call the top. It means he was at the top of the non-commissioned officers. That's why, I guess that's the reason why they call him top. I don't know, but he's one of our members there at Cartersville. Very important to us there. But they're going to be going back to Panama some, spend time in Panama, from which his wife is from, Ilka. And Ilka has just found out about her DNA. She got somebody. Did you get her to do that DNA, or somebody else get it?
Lucy and Ilka both did it together.
Oh, Lucy and Ilka, their daughter, and her did it together. And she found out that she was 23%.
She's 29% Chinese,
24%
Spanish.
And what?
She's 29% Chinese, 24% Spanish.
Okay. Well, that's 53%, so she just got to figure out the other 47. And so we kind of kidded about. We always bowing at her because we found out that she was Chinese, and so
that's my baby.
Lovely lady and very friendly, and we really appreciate her. But they'll be going back to Panama some, so maybe they can carry Georgia School of Preaching over there with them. Okay, the Greeks. When we talk about travel, and in the book, in Brother Ferguson's book, he does a good job also, and I use some of the same passages. The Bible helps us to see some things about travel, and I mean it's really amazing to me because of I may be the oldest one on here, and so I was born in 1948, and I can remember when we had a car. My father had a car because he had to work. as far as I remember, he always had a car. I got a picture of me in the first grade, and he has a car. But when he and my mother divorced, we didn't have a car. And so I can remember old cars that we finally got and bicycles and all that kind of stuff. And I even saw when I went to Vietnam how that they got around on their carts, ox carts, and water buffaloes, and Honda 350 Honda motorcycles. Now they're 350, and I had seen up to 6 people on one of those things. And they have all kinds of stuff on them and all kinds of modes of travel that way, but it was nothing compared to what they had in the first century. The Greeks and the Romans traveled for many of the same reasons that we would do today. And so they had business interests all over the Mediterranean basin. And they had contacts eventually extending to India and China. And I'm going to jump over here because I want to read Epictetus exclaimed this in his discourses. He says, Caesar has obtained for us a profound peace. There are neither wars nor battles, nor great robberies, nor piracies. But we may travel at all hours and sail from east to the west. Now, the point is that he's pointing out to us there, they could travel basically the very same way that we can travel. You know, I mean, we do understand that that we have problems just like they did as they would travel. You know, they maybe travel by camelback or whatever animal that animal die on their way, and we may be going on in a car, and all of a sudden the car dies, and we have it repaired and so on. So they basically moved around like we did, and for the same reasons that we did. But government work kept a large number of people on the move. The wealthy moved several times a year to one or another of their villas. You know, it's like Jim there. He's getting ready to leave his villa in Cartersville and go down to Panama. People of all classes had spas and shrines, and especially those of Asclepius, the god of healing. And they attended famous festivals like the Olympic Games, you know, like we have in Augusta going on. You have all kinds of people down in Augusta seeing the golf game. But Roman doctors held sea voyages. The Romans added pure sightseeing to their reasons for being on the road. And Tiberius, nephew of Germicus, rubbernecked his way all around Egypt like any modern tourist would done. Seneca complains about people afflicted with an unhealthy restlessness and undertake aimless journeys. Could you imagine bringing Seneca in the 21st century, 2019? What he would think about what the mode of travel that we have? He'd probably say we're all crazy. But if we think about travel in the New Testament, Paul's journeys immediately come to mind. Because when you read the book of Acts, now, there's many things that we say in reference to the book of Acts. I mean, people tell us the different purposes of it and so forth. But basically, Jesus gave us the point in Acts 1 and verse 8. He pointed out there, he says that they were supposed to go to Jerusalem, which they were at Jerusalem. Then they would go throughout all Judea. Then they would go to Samaria, and then they would go to the uttermost parts of the earth. So we would find basically that's what the book of Acts does. But boil it right down, the gospel, the book of Acts covers how the gospel went from Jerusalem to Rome. And so in that, because we're seeing how that Rome, the New Testament world, that it'd be the Roman world at that time for the New Testament, we'll see how that Paul and all the others, how that they would travel as they would go. And they about like us, you know, I think when we went to Riga, Latvia, we got on the airplane here in Atlanta, and I think we flew to Germany and had to get off and wait in Germany, and we waited in the airport, you know, and so forth. Well, then we got another plane, and on our way back had to do the very same thing. I think we stopped twice on the way back. But the point being is that Paul had to do the very same thing. As he would travel, it'd be quicker for him, if he possibly could, it'd be quicker for him to get on a ship instead of walk, because, you know, unless the wind wasn't blowing or the tides weren't the way they're supposed to be. And lost my train of thought. But anyway, they would travel basically like we would. I mean, have stopovers, and there were quicker ways to go and so forth. If you're not in a hurry, you know, like Jim said, you know, I could get on the ship and go to Panama. It takes a little longer, but you get on an airplane and get right there. You know, and so it's the same way. But he combined, that is Paul, he combined land and sea travel and experienced many of the difficulties that were associated with both of those. Even Mary and Joseph traveled first to Bethlehem, according to Luke, then to Egypt and back, according to Matthew. The Magi made a long journey to see Jesus, and Jesus himself traveled all over Judea and Galilee and expected his disciples to travel even in pairs among Judea or to the ends of the earth, Acts 1 and verse 8. So what was travel like? Now, in the book, Mr. Bell's book, he shows a picture there. And when you look at the picture, it says up under it, a Roman road in Syria paved with limestone blocks. Now, when I look at that, it looks like me that that's a wall. But that's the way they built their roads back then. They had to build them up because, again, they have the same problems we have in reference to drainage. But in Luke 2 and verse 41, the Bible says that is Jesus' parents, went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. So wherever they lived in Nazareth, they would go all the way to the Jerusalem in order for that of the Passover, because that was one of those yearly feasts that they would attend. In Acts 2 and verse 5 says, now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. Now, if a person did not have a Bible background, then they would probably just simply say, well, how in the world did all those Jews get through all these different places? Well, it is because of the dispersion that took place. And they were dispersed all throughout the world back in captivity. And so they were carried to different places. And so the Jews traveled more than almost any other people of the Mediterranean world during the first century. And so with the exception of Navy men and merchant marines and a few others, that's because that was their responsibilities to keep everything safe. And so just like we have people today, I meet people that was in the Navy, and the first thing I think about when you're in the Navy, that you was on a ship or a submarine. Well, that's not always true. They did other things besides that, but also they would fly because there is the Navy pilots and so forth. But Jews were supposed to go to Jerusalem for Passover. Then they were supposed to also go there for Pentecost. And they're supposed to go there for the Feast of Weeks. That's the three feasts that they had to keep. And they were supposed to contribute their half shekel annually for the support of that of the temple when they go. And so they had a responsibility. But many times, some of them did not go. There was ways they had to travel. And then as they would travel, they had to have, Motel 6, we'll leave the light on for you. No, they didn't have that, but they had places where they would stay. And a lot of places, as we've already seen in that of the birth of Christ, as we looked at that, is that as they would travel, that many of the people would open up their houses. They would rent rooms. Just recently, I found a place up in Cummins on a tenth of an acre. The camper would sleep 500 feet from the water. And the man wanted $27,000 for it, and I was interested, but my wife wasn't. But I thought maybe we could just rent it out every once in a while and make our money back. But she said she wasn't interested, so we do that. But you notice that people do that. That's what they did in the early parts there. That they would build that extra room, and then they would bring all their family into the other room, and then they let somebody sleep in that other room. But since it was not safe for a single family to travel alone, or if you transport the temple tax over a great distance, people joined festival caravans and headed for that of Jerusalem. And evidently Jesus' parents joined such a group at the time that Jesus was 12, Luke 2 and verse 44, and Jesus and his disciples later attached themselves to a similar group around Jericho, Mark 10 and verse 46. Now, if you go to Acts chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, the account of Pentecost just after the resurrection. It's the first Pentecost after the resurrection of Christ. So that way we'll get it right. It gives a formidable list of pilgrims from Rome and provinces and even territories beyond the borders of the empire. They had the Parthians, the Medes, the Elamites, the dwellers of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, and Pontus, and Asia, and Phrygia, and Pamphylia, and Egypt, and Libya, and all the way around Cyrene, and Rome, and Crete, and Arabia. People from all those places, Jews from all those places, came to the day of Pentecost. Now, we have to remember now that what's going on, that we've already looked at and studied, is basically that those Jewish people that I forgot to cut my battery on. Boy, about dead. People that traveled all the way to that of Rome. But we have to remember those Jewish people, as they were the ones that dispersed, they had already picked up on some of the Hellenistic or the Greek Gentile culture, and they had adapted some of that. So you had these people, basically they were kind of, when they would show up, they was kind of strange, different, and with some things. And so that all that would take place, and that's going to bring some problems. But they traveled. You had in modern terms, they came from Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, Libya, Italy, Crete, and Arabia. That's where all these people came from if we were to give today's countries. Then Barnabas and certain others had come from Cyprus, and the treasurer of the Ethiopian queen Candace made a journey to Jerusalem for some religious purpose. Most people sometimes don't gather the reason why he went to Jerusalem was to worship, Acts 8:27-39. And then also you had, according to Acts 2 and verse 10, you had proselytes or God-fearers also that went to these festivals. In John 12 and verse 20, now there were certain Greeks among those who came up to worship at the feast. So we did have those who were proselytes, and it just says Greeks there, but the only way they could worship is that they would have to become proselytes. They had to be, their males would have to be circumcised, and therefore there were certain limitations placed upon them when they would go to the temple, that they could not go inside the temple, but they could become proselytes. In other words, they were Jewish. They were circumcised. They kept the 10 Commandments and the other commandments they were supposed to. They paid their annual tax to that of to keep the temple up and so on. So there was constant movement between that of Syria and Palestine. And within Palestine, people who were closer to Jerusalem could come more often. Now, the Palestinian residents might hope to go to Jerusalem for one of the 3 festivals annually. But those living abroad did well to make the pilgrimage to the holy city once in a lifetime. And so, as we've noted earlier, more than 100,000 might attend one festival. In addition to all this travel to Jerusalem, religious leaders occasionally came to the city from Jewish communities abroad to confer with members of the establishment. And so you think of the comings and the goings of the apostles and other missionary teams as they sought to spread the gospel. The story is told in different chapters of the book of Acts where they went. And sometimes I remember teaching a class in the book of Acts. It was a midday class for those people who worked at night. And we had a Wednesday midday class for them at Cartersville. And that's what we did. We looked at all the places that these people went in reference to the towns. And you read Acts chapter 9 and so forth and looking at the Apostle Paul when he was converted. But if you keep reading, you'll find that Peter is pretty close to Joppa and Caesarea. And then what happens in Acts chapter 10 in reference to Cornelius. But the most natural form of travel during that time, but by no means the most comfortable, was by land. Now, we travel by land. We have modern things, and they did not have what we have. It required considerable time, and the dangers inherent in it were not to be lightly disregarded. We talk about sometimes the roads from Jericho to Jerusalem or Jerusalem back to Jericho, and how those things take place, like in Luke chapter 10, beginning verse 30. Jesus tells a story about a man who fell among the thieves on his journey. This is the Good Samaritan. His audience knew the reality of which he spoke. Paul also reeled off some of the perils which he had encountered when he would go from different places on his journeys in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 26 and 27. We find that there he talks, and I'm going to mark that because for some reason I didn't mark my passages this time. He talks about that. He says dangers from rivers, and dangers from bandits. And that sounds like to us now when we stop and think about that. Dangers of the wilderness. We look at those first 3 and we remember probably learning in classes about our American history, or we've actually seen movies made of the early times in America and how they had to travel, and the dangers of that of the rivers, and the dangers of that of bandits, and the dangers of that of the wilderness. But they also had the danger at sea. And also there was hunger, there was thirst. People were hungry and thirsty and often without food, cold and naked, Paul said. So even in Italy itself, a wealthy Roman could simply disappear while traveling. In other words, somebody would kill him, or he would just drown in the rivers, or he'd get lost in the wilderness and die. But in spite of all of that, and land travel was far safer and more convenient in the 1st century BC than it had ever been in that of human history. And it didn't get any better until the introduction of railroads in the middle of the 19th century. Now, again, Epictetus, here what I read earlier, he says there in reference to Caesar, he says, but we may travel at all hours and see from east to west. And so, again, they were able to travel because of government, what government had done for them, and therefore the protection that was given. So a trip from London to Rome in Nero's time took 28 days, assuming there were no major problems, 28 days. So at the beginning of Queen Victoria's reign in 1832, the same trip took about the same amount of time and was complicated by crossing several national borders. And so today, I mean, you know, we get a passport and we get on an airplane and we fly. It takes from Fort Ord, California to go to Cam Ranh Bay, Vietnam, it took about 23 hours. And we stopped one time, fill it with fuel. So we can move, you know, today around. But travel or transport of goods, now again, you know, we go out here to, most of y'all know where I-75 is. We go out here to I-75 and you pull off the side of the road. And some nights when I leave here and go, and if they've had a little problem out there, there's 3 lanes eventually going into Bartow County, and 2 of those lanes are back-to-back trucks. So that's how they move. The majority of our goods is moved by that of trucks. Well, back here, the majority of their goods would take place on that of land. Individual men using a head strap or in pairs carrying sacks or vessels suspended from poles moved all sorts of goods from place to place. In Vietnam, you'd see Papa Son, and that's what he'd have. He'd have a pole-like thing on him, and he'd have something hanging from each one of them, and they were balanced. And sometimes he'd just hold his, you know, put his hands on his hip, and he'd just be walking along. But that's how they traveled. And then if you're like with sometimes one time there we were on bridge control, we'd see them go, like they'd go into the village of Hocmon, and then they'd come back and they'd have something else. And what they were doing, they were trading food and so forth. But the animals was the donkey and so forth was a pack animal of choice, however. And we understand that our understanding of the donkey or the mule, that it could carry up to 130 pounds in 2 half packs, one on each side, at a rate of about 2.5 miles per hour for 6 hours for a total of 15 miles a day. A mule, on the other hand, could carry a load of 160 pounds at a rate of 3 to 4 miles per hour for a total of 20 to 25 miles a day. Now, that's how they travel. And you and I probably, well, some of us may have seen TV programs about the Wells Fargo or how the mail got from one place to the other, and they'd ride those horses and they'd jump off and jump on another one with the mail and all that kind of stuff, and then eventually put them on stagecoach, bunches of mail. Well, they didn't do that here. What they did, they traveled and then they stopped and they rest all night. They didn't have other animals waiting on them, and maybe eventually they did have outposts, as we call them, I guess, like we did. But when you look at the Romans, this is the way that things work. Now, the road system, and again in the book, we'll talk about Antioch, and I hope, I don't know if all y'all have the book. Some of y'all have the book. If you look at the book, and some of you shaking your head no, the Romans were made relatively convenient travel possible by policing their territory to cut down on highway bandits. Plus, there was that, remember we studied about the laws and so forth, so there were some laws that would protect people who travel. Though they could never entirely eliminate them, which we can't, and by providing superb roads that crisscrossed the empire from Scotland to Arabia, from Morocco to that of the Black Sea, the Roman system of roads was unequal until the development of the modern interstate highways after World War II. They had good roads, and everywhere, you know, places they could go. So if you find a map and you can find one on the internet, you may want to go look up the roads the Roman road system in the first century. And you can see all the different roads. And what I would tell you to do is be like with us. Remember now when you go on the internet and you pull up a map, all of a sudden they show you the state of Georgia. They show you one picture and probably Atlanta right in the middle. Then if you make that thing smaller, it makes the roads lesser and lesser. So what you have to do is, like if you were to pull up the areas like that, you want to just see, well, what kind of road system did they have on Cyprus, the island of Cyprus? Well, you put that thing on there, and if you'll make it big, it'll show the roads. And so you'll see the system, the road system. The civilians could use the roads, but soldiers and persons on government business always had the right of way. A large military contingent in passages could force all other traffic off a road for several hours, days in some cases. Now, I can relate to that because, again, I was an infantry soldier, and sometimes we were with tanks, and sometimes would have convoys and so forth. But even when the convoys go through, when we even went through the village, everybody got off on the side of the road. We had the right of way because we didn't hang around in villages because they tried to shoot us. So we go through it. But even when we walked, when we marched and we were going somewhere, we was going down the road, they got off the road for us. And so because of the right of way. And so that's what they did then. Not only did Rome permit a free flow of people around the Mediterranean area, but also Rome encouraged or facilitated the movement with her own version of interstate highways. That famous highway system got started 300 years before Christ was born. The Romans continued, and remember now, they were conquering the world at that time. They continued its rapid expansion well into the first century after Christ commissioned his disciples go into all the world. And so around AD 100, this universal road system comprised of 250,000 miles of paved or improved roads, a distance 10 times around the earth at the equator. Now, can you imagine that? In 100 AD, I don't know what they think about the potholes we have around here. I don't know about y'all, but we have potholes in Bartow County. I always say something, like that commercial, I'm a pothole. Y'all heard that commercial? I told Linda one day, I said, we got a 3-time resurfaced pothole out there. It's been resurfaced 3 times. It's still a pothole. So we have potholes. And so they had a system. And so the premier said, this is where we came out. They said all roads lead to Rome. I've heard that for years. And so that was a fact. That was a milestone that stood in the forum at Rome with a regular distance by road from Rome to the chief cities of the empire. The Roman roads and bridges were engineered as well that stretches of them survive all over Europe today, and in some cases are still used for local traffic. The roads were typically laid down on a base of gravel, poured in a trench, covered by large stones in areas where traffic were especially heavy. Gravel or dirt might be the surface of the roads used more lightly. The roads always slided higher in the middle and on the sides to ensure proper drainage and were lined with ditches and curves. I wonder where we got our plan about how to make roads. In 122 BC, Caius Gracchus began the practice of placing stones at frequent intervals to enable riders to mount their horses without assistance. A necessity because stirrups were unknown in Western Europe before BC 800. Plutarch mentions people training their horses to kneel when they are too feeble or lazy to mount them properly. So, and he does that in his book, or in a chapter in his book on marriage. He talks about that on marriage, chapter 8. Near the cities, the pedestrians paths were maintained alongside the major roads, but in the countryside, people walked on the same surface used by the vehicular traffic, with the results that they were sometimes run over. Now, when I was doing mission work over in Riga, Latvia, we was riding the trams, and we turned this corner, and there laid a man in the street, and I think I mentioned that to you, and he was dead. Nobody was stopping. He was just laying there dead. Even our tram went around him. I mean, we looked out the window, and there he lay, and he was dead. And finally, a policeman showed up, but everybody was just let him lay there. He was dead. So some people would get run over. Some Romans apparently became maniacs. What do we call them today? Rage drivers, highway rage, interstate rage. So they had some of those too behind their reins, that is, riding their horses. Nero's biological father, Domitus Henobarbus, once deliberately run down a child in the road, according to Suetonius. Now, Suetonius is one that writes about that of Nero. He has a history on him. In addition to their system, their major thoroughfares, the Romans built secondary roads with gravel or dirt surfaces, and so these were usually maintained by the local governments, and that's what we would do. And so we're not as fine as maybe the highways, and that's the way it was in Vietnam. They had major highways, and the same would be true. I remember in Bartow County, we lived on a dirt road, and they come by and they would scrape that dirt road. So they got, we got pretty well up in Bartow County. So finally, we got some gravel put on the road. Then we got a new commissioner, and he said, "I'm going to pave every road." And so he come along and put tar all over them rocks. And so we had begun to have all roads everywhere. Then they began, and one said that he was going to pave every one of the roads was asphalt, and that's what basically had happened. But these people, they just simply travel between small towns. The usefulness of such roads is apparent when Pliny talks about a trip to one of his villas outside of that of Rome. He says it is 17 miles from Rome, so that it is possible to spend the night there after necessary business is done without having cut short or hurried the day's work, and it can be approached by more than one route. The roads to Laurentum and Ostia both lead in that direction, but you must leave the one at the 14th milestone and the other at the 11th. Whichever way you go, the side road you take is simply for some distance and rather heavy and slow going if you drive, but soft and easy covered on horseback. The view on either side is full of variety, for sometimes the road narrows as it passes through the woods, and then it broadens and opens through wild meadows. And so he just talks about as they travel. And we should recall that the day's work ended for them at noon. So Pliny had several hours to make the trip and still arrive in time for an early dinner. His comment about the width of the road is of interest because 8 feet was the minimum width of a Roman road, except for the need to build on the side of a mountain. And so occasionally it forced them down to one lane of 5 or 6 feet. Now, I've never traveled up to Alaska, but I understand that some places up there that the road gets kind of narrow, but I still think there's two that vehicles can pass one another, but there are places where you pull over. And not only that, but I guess they've already started the paving up there because of the weather. But in some cases, they would pull it over so that people could pass. And so flat ground, a width of 10 or 12 feet was common, broadening to 30 or 40 feet as the road approached a major city. Now, in the book, he shows the road system of Antioch, and you can see that because of the way it looks, it's a general layout of the city of Antioch. Herod the Great, it is said, paved the main street of Antioch with marble, and there is online, if you go and you look in reference to look up Antioch. Or even the road system, and they'll show you some of those roads like that. Over 2 miles long, it measured 31 feet in width. And Tiberius, between 14 and 37, built roofed colonnades 32 feet wide along each side of the street. And at the end intersection, he erected to plyrons, that is vaulted stone roofs supported on 4 columns. Over 3,200 columns, many of them pink and gray granite, composed the colonnade, and bronze decorations were attached to many of them. And through the columns, one could enter public buildings and shops and villas, and then one could walk the entire length of the city, northeast to southwest, undercover. And so possibly the world's first enclosed shopping mall, as we would call it, if you want to call it that. Also, we find that there were major roads that crisscrossed across Palestine. The Romans built a coastal road from Pelusium in Egypt through that of Gaza and Ascalon, Caesarea, and Tyre. So you had all that system there. Then it continued north to that of the Syrian capital of Antioch and east to Tigris. And so this road has been used from that of antiquity. And so other ancient roads were busy with commerce. One led from Babylon all the way across to the central Euphrates in the desert of the Jordan River, crossed it north of the Sea of Galilee, descended in the Jordan Valley to Bethshem, where it turned into the Jezreel Valley, and finally joined the coastal road of Mount Carmel. And so another ran from southwest Arabia, north parallel to that of the Red Sea, carrying luxury goods of Arabia and Africa. So at Petra, about 50 miles south of the Dead Sea, it branched to Egypt and Gaza and Damascus. And a road also ran north along the watershed through that of Hebron. And so you had Jerusalem and Samaria that the points north. So you had looked like if you go look at the maps that they have, that they have those roads on it, they had roads just about everywhere. And again, they're not like ours, but for the means of their travel, they were they were good roads. Now, we cannot envision Joseph and Mary calling AAA to get a map for their trip to Egypt. Yet well-educated ancients did, in fact, have a reasonable good sense of what their world looked like, at least until they got to the edges. This sphericity of the earth had been fairly common knowledge since the time of Pythagoras around 540 BC. By 200 BC, Eratosthenes of Alexandria had calculated the Earth's circumference to within a few hundred miles, and had devised a system of mapping the Earth using lines of longitude and latitude. Cicero gives one of the most excellent statements of the Roman view of the earth in the book on the nature of God. And Ovid also describes God as shaping the earth into a ball. Now, isn't that amazing that we see that? And then we also remember Isaiah says the earth is circle. And so here we are with all this information, and then we would find that a man by the name of Columbus, during his times, they thought the earth was flat. But the Romans portrayed the earth as a ball on their coins. The geographical Claudius Ptolemy provided directions for making maps on both flats and spheric surfaces. The problem of the distortion on the flat surface, which he mentioned, is one that still plagues cartographers to even today. On a Mercator projection. Now, I don't know what that is. Some of y'all older than I may know what that is. The distortion on a flat surface is mentioned on this on a Mercator projector. Greenland appears 16 times its actual size, so it's not actual, as we would stop and think about that. Before setting out on a journey, an ancient traveler could purchase a map, not to learn the distance between the towns. The milestones told him that, but to learn what sorts of accommodations were available. Known as itineraries, these were commonplace in the 1st century, but none survived except in the 11th century. You have the Putinger table, a copy of a 3rd century map of all the roads in the Roman Empire. And it uses different symbols to indicate the various sorts of time or ends, that is, as a traveler could expect to find. So when you think about mapping the earth, we have one of our members at Carsville, Brother Noah, Howard Noah, used to be one of the elders at Woodstock, and they worship with us in Carsville now. And that's what he did in the military, was mapping. I had a good friend that flew in Vietnam. That wasn't what his MOS was, but he became a E6 first sergeant, Jim. And I don't think he did ever get above E6. I don't know if he kept in trouble or what. But he was made a first sergeant over a helicopter group, and then when he came back the 3rd time, he got in with some major about flying, and they flew is it a P-32? I know we call P-38, that's that can opener, but wasn't there a 332 airplane? Yeah, they took pictures all over Vietnam, and my friend Ray, that's what he did. He flew with the colonel, and he took pictures. And every once in a while, the major let him fly the airplane, but he wasn't supposed to tell anybody. He loved flying. And but that's what they did. They went out and took pictures of all the areas to make maps. And so here they didn't have that thing, but drawing a map on a sphere gives the likeness of the shape of the earth, but it's hard to make it large enough to allow room for all the details that must be indicated, and it's impossible to take the whole thing in one side at one time. At Cartersville, we have, because of personal work, and we have done a door knocking and so forth, we have a map of Bartow County, and it's just like a regular, I mean, like this book in front of me is probably 10 by 12 or something like that. And you have one like that, but then we got that same little old map there, and we got it open into something like a 3 foot by 3 foot, big old map, and it got every little road, every little detail that you can look on that thing. And so you see everything. So it requires some adjustments to correspond to the spheric shape in order to make the distances of those flat surfaces commensurable with the actual distance. And so the decision as to the size of the sphere would depend on how detailed the map maker wishes his work to be. So this is a function of his skill. And so as the size of the sphere then increase, and so the amount of detail and accuracy of the map would also be there. But then we would think about, again, here's Joseph and Mary. Yeah, they don't have a GPS, and they don't call AAA. But neither do they call Holiday Inn Travel Club and make arrangements for accommodation. The average traveler covered only about 20 or so miles a day. Now, the average traveler, now again, remember, if they're on horseback, it's 20 to 25 miles a day. If they're using a mule, it's 15 miles. So if necessary on long trips, to plan to stop each night. So here, these inns were available. And you can imagine, like us, that if we were living then, and say here we are in Marietta, and it's approximately from here to, we'll say, Interstate 75 and Highway 20. That's where I get off. Probably between 20 and 23 miles. I'm not really for sure. And most likely, if we were leaving here and we left early in the morning, by the time we got up there, it would be night time. And so we would want a place to stay. So you can imagine what that place would look like. Well, we know what it looks like up there now. Got hotels everywhere. Just about every intersection around a big city, you have that. So that's what they would do. People would say, well, we'll build our house, but we'll have an extra room or for an inn, or they'd make extra rooms. And sometimes the government, those Caesars, they were smart enough to say, well, we can make money by having these people stay in those, because they had to pay to stay, unless you stayed with your friend. If the inn where Mary and Joseph stayed had a stable, it was not the shabby place it is often portrayed in as being what it is in some of these Christmas stories. Only the more substantial inns had such facilities, and others offered little more than a roof and a fire by which to sleep. It appears, however, that was lacking was a room in our sense of the word. All the rooms were filled. So this would suggest that the inn was particularly nice. Not all inns offer private rooms. And so judging from the archaeological remains, inns were spaced closer together or farther apart, depending on the difficulty of the terrain. Inns were often dirty and infested with disreputable and dangerous characters, I remember one time where Linda and I stopped, and we were tired, and we opened up, pulled the cover back, and you could tell somebody had already slept in the bed. So we found, hair and stuff like that. So what we did, because we were so tired, we just put the top cover back on, and we went to sleep. And when we left the next morning, we told them, and plus we wrote the company and told them. But you couldn't find a place to sleep. Couldn't find a hotel room. We had to find one quickly because we were tired. The poet Horace, around 40 BC, left a vivid portrayal of the places in his humorous description of a trip which he made from Rome to Brundisium on the hill of Italy. Around both Petronius and Apulus showed that the conditions in the inns did not improve, but noticeably with the passage of time. Characters in both of their works are attacked while staying in the inns. And we don't see much of that. Even in America, in the 48 continental United States, there are things happen at some of the motels and hotels and inns, however you want to say that. the resorts that we have. Some things happen, but compared to the probably the population, then there's not very many of those. If travelers found a decent inn, there was no guarantee would have a room for them, even if other travelers hadn't filled it. Someone on the government business might commander rooms and services, and his need would take precedence over anybody, even a young woman who was about to become a mother, like Mary. So an innkeeper was required by law to furnish anything requested by someone traveling with a pass from the emperor or the governor, just as civilians were required to assist such persons by carrying burdens for a mile, Matthew 5 and verse 41. Only persons on official business, particularly the delivery of dispatches to and from Rome, were supposed to have these passes. Now, the aim of the system was to speed communications between the province and the capital. When I worked for the state of Georgia Department of Veterans Service, when we traveled, we had to show our ID, and therefore they would give us a room. And so we would get it cheaper, and then we'd be reimbursed, but they would always have a government room for us. The emperors strictly limited the number of passes in circulation at any given time as so not to overburden the system. But abuses of that privilege were common. Even Pliny himself, as governor of Bithynia, let his wife use a pass when she wanted to return home to her ailing mother. The Emperor Trajan excused him with a mild scolding. And we've actually seen some of that kind of stuff, where politicians or people that they will let somebody go with them on a trip and so forth. They're riding on government money. We've seen that, and again, it's a violation, and so that was a violation. He got a scolding. Where possible, travelers stayed with friends or with family. Or friends with friends of friends. And so Paul didn't even wait for an invitation from Philemon, but just told him to prepare a guest room for me. Philemon verse 22. So the obligation to entertain family and friends was passed on from one generation to the next. Places where I have preached, people always say, well, you can stay with us if you come by. And we now, because of our age and because of our what do you call it? Our habits, I guess is the word that we have about sleeping and so forth. Now we just say, well, we'd rather just stay in a motel. When I do gospel meetings, most of the time I stay with a family, or if there's no family, then I stay in a motel. If it's close enough, I drive back home. But here they would stay with friends or friends of friends or maybe family that was there. The obligation to entertain was, like I said, given from generation to generation. There would also be letters of introduction, were a valuable commodity, for they ensured that the bearer would find lodging in an unfamiliar city. We have, and probably some of you at the congregations, we've had people who got real sick, or maybe a child got real sick, or somebody in their family, and they would have to go in, like when we lived in Alabama, they'd have to go to Tuscaloosa or Birmingham or something like that. Here, go to Atlanta, and we have a McDonald's house. Well, we would know people that live in the area, and we would say, look, these people don't have the money to be staying in a hotel. Do you have a place that they can stay? And and most times they would put them up, on our recommendation that they were members of the church and they were a good family and so forth, and so they would allow them to stay. Now, we find that Paul opens doors for some of his friends in a passage like Romans 16. He says, I commend you, our sister Phoebe, a deaconess of the church at Caesarea, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as it is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatsoever she may require for you. Similar introductions are given in 1 Corinthians 16:10 and also Colossians 4:7-10. That Paul would just simply say that, so when those people would come around, they would stay. When I went to When I went to Rigalappy to do that mission work for those 3 weeks, they said, all right, you come and we'll have a place for you to stay. Well, we got there. We stayed with a male member of the church, his wife, and 17-year-old daughter. They weren't members, he was. And that's where we stayed. And they treated us royally, because we were preachers and teachers of the gospel, even though that the wife and the daughter was not a member of the church. And we introduced them to good American food like peanut butter. They didn't know what peanut butter was. And then before we left there, the market came, and he went to, I can't think of his name now, but he went to the market, And when he came back, he had a gallon jar or a gallon can of peanut butter. They love peanut butter when we lived. But we carried aspirins and things like that. But again, we stayed with them. Now, where did Barnabas and company find accommodation? That would be the whole thing. You got to have those accommodations. You got to have food. You got to have laundry facilities as they travel. That's one of the things that I guess that I would wonder more about. I know we've gotten some information in reference to how their cleanliness in the sense of baths and so forth. I know they had the open baths, people would take baths, but as they would travel that way, because you go to some of the other countries and they kind of look at us and say, well, why do you take the bath all the time? So the physician Luke reports on their going about from place to place, but he writes nothing about where they stayed or how they met their personal needs. And I understand that when you read the book of Acts, that's not the important part. The important part is that they're carrying the gospel at different places. But nothing is much said about all that. In the first place, they were sent by the Antioch church and evidently carried funds for their support. Secondly, they were inns or places where businessmen, government agents could stay. And third, Oriental or Mediterranean hospitality was practiced from earlier times to the present. The Old Testament has accounts of preferred strangers or perfect strangers being entertained in the home from Abraham's day on down. Fourth, Barnabas had owned property in Cyprus and presumably still had relatives and possibly even property on the land, on the island. Fifth, by the time the trio landed, there were converts of the persecuted preachers, Acts 11 and verse 19, who would properly receive them. And in sixth, there were their own converts or others who might receive them into their home. And you remember, Jesus himself had given instructions to the itinerant evangelists always staying in private homes in Matthew chapter 10, 11 through 13. And so this is where they would actually, they would stay. So they would have these accommodations, but we're not given a lot of information in reference to that, except that they go from place to place. Any thoughts or questions? Okay, I have 724. So it's time, we're going to look at the amenities as they travel. We're going to look at a passage or two, and then we will, that's what we'll do when we come back. Okay? Don't have
Hey,
to
Bobby.
Yes, ma'am.
There's a gentleman that might be stopping by the building. Are the doors still unlocked?
Yeah.
Usually? Okay.
Yeah,
He's gonna
but
drop
stay
something
unlocked all the time we're here.
Okay. All right. He thinks he'll be there before 8:30, so.
Well, Tommy will be here. Bobby will be gone.
Well, if it's going to be later, he's
I tell him this. he needs to come to the building.
Well, they're traveling through. They had some stuff they wanted to drop off, and I said, well, there'll be somebody at the building till 8:30, so he'll let me know if he's not going to make it by then.
And he's going to drop it off for the church here?
Yeah, so.
Okay, I'll tell Tommy. And
Since at the back door.
I told him I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, when 8:30 comes, if he hadn't got here, then I'll, we can stay on until you can't get a hold of them and see where they are. Can you get in touch with him?
I can always call him, and we'll just try to meet him because he's heading north on I-75. We'll just try to meet him over on I-75, worst case scenario. So.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Kitty cat. We got one of those.
One? You want another one?
We had a white one for 20 years, 19 years.
Yeah.
Oh,
Seems like they don't die. I mean, they don't go away.
I know we had one black one, solid black one after that named Jumper. We just fell in love with her. She was, or he just couldn't defend himself. He got beat up for that. But we have one now. Her name is Miss Alice. I call her Miss A. Now we changed her name. We call her out in and in out. So she wants it when she's in, she wants out. When she's out, she wants in.
Yeah, that's this one.
Yep.
I mean, it's all day long.
Yep.
Then at night time when I'm trying to study with my computer and everything's right by the screen, and she wants in, she starts hitting the screen with her foot, with her paw. Let me in, let me in. So.
He likes to just meow incessantly, going, "Let me out, let me out." So you open the door. He stands at the door and looks at it. It's like, well, either you want out or you don't. Go.
Yeah. Now, Miss Alice does that too. She's sometimes she get ready to go and she'll stop because she's heard something. She don't like loud noises. If it's a storm coming up, she can find someplace and you won't find her. She hides.
Yeah.
Our neighbor's dog got a little too close.
Oh.
So now he's a little bit more gun shy, let's just say.
Very skittish.
Oh well.
Yeah.
Yep. But I told Linda, I said, we got 3 dogs. We got 3 dogs and a cat. None of them belongs to me, but I have to feed them. And the dogs we got, they like to dig holes in my yard. And that's what I did this morning, go around filling up holes. And when they see me with a shovel and doing that, they run and hide because they know if I get them, I'm going to be in it. Okay, Rebecca, you there or you asleep?
I'm here.
You here? I'm supposed to tell you something, Evan.
What's that read?
Oh, yeah. What's Jim's brother's name?
Peter.
What's his wife's name?
Jen.
What?
Jen. I call her Good Jen.
What's her name? Jennifer?
Jennifer, yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Sister Noel's been talking to them, or talking to Jennifer.
Oh, yes.
And so she says that maybe you can talk to her too.
Oh, yes.
You want me to carry clothes down there and have them clean, so, she's been trying to work with them, so I'll let you know. She told me to tell you to do what you could.
Oh, yeah, I've been trying. There's a little bit of reluctance, shall we say, but.
Well, she said she's invited her to come. That's what it was. She wants you and Jim to come Sunday for our gospel meeting and get them to come and stay for the meal afterwards so that, she can meet them better or something like that, if you can.
Tell Jen to come to the gospel meeting.
Yeah, y'all come. You and Jim come too, and y'all stay eating with us.
Is it in Cartersville?
Yeah, Jody Apple's going to be there. I'll be late. I'll be preaching in Rockmart, so I'll be late. But I'm gonna come because we eat. Preacher show. All right.
I'll talk to Jim, definitely.
Okay. All right. I told you. I got witnesses. Okay. It's all about the travel amenities. And again, sometimes we think of, that in the New Testament, people typically walked, and but basically, even that was the way that people would go. But basically that was more so of the poorer people. They would always walk to where they're going. But this idea of traveling by some type of vehicle, as we would call it, in other words, on a cart, whatever it may be, it was common there also. It's like Paul. He writes to Timothy. He tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, verse 13, he says, the cloak that I left at Troas with Carpus, when thou comest, bring with thee, and the books, but especially the parchments. Now, this is 2 Timothy chapter 4, and this is the last epistle that Paul writes, and Paul is most likely, well, not most likely, Paul is in jail, in prison for the second time, and he won't be living long, but he's telling him to do that. So we can conclude that Timothy would not be making the trip on foot. So considering Paul's health problems, one wonders whether he could have walked all over Asia Minor and Greece, but Mary being well along in even her pregnancy, it's not likely that she walked from Nazareth to that of Bethlehem. And I know we see her, that she was on a donkey and so on, but the mother of the poet Virgil set out on a short trip during her pregnancy and ended up giving birth in a ditch, according to Suetonius, the historian. And so traditionally, as we said, we look at Mary riding a donkey, but Luke never mentions her mode of transportation. And Joseph was a man of some means. He was a carpenter, and so they might well have ridden in some sort of carriage. It could be. And sometimes we assume a lot of things in reference to some of those stories, and basically because they've been handed down to us and we haven't actually looked at what the Bible says in reference to those. So there were various styles of carriages or wagons. Now, we remember, and I think probably the one that sticks out more to me than anything is in the New Testament is in Acts chapter 8. You got the eunuch. He's in his chariot. And the eunuch being a treasurer, it doesn't say that he has a driver with him, but he is a high government official. And so we would find that he was, he went that way. That is, he had a chariot. And so that was a good way of travel. As we would think in reference to Mary and all of them, how they got around, there's all these different styles of carriages and wagons, and they could be rented in one town, like U-Haul. In U-Haul, you can go right up the road here from Piedmont Church Building, and they have a U-Haul place on the left-hand side going toward Interstate 75, and you can rent one of those things, and you can rent it for the rest of the night and bring it back tomorrow, or you can rent one and go all the way out to California, and you can leave it out there when you move out there. So, but so that idea is they had that same idea. They could rent wagons. They had families in different places, and probably business that was together in sense in doing that. In other words, if you got a wagon from John, and he's Jim is one down in Nazareth, and when you get to Nazareth, you carry old Jim's place and return it there, because we have business together, like that type of thing. A driver could be hired also during that time. They did, Bale makes this point. He says, a driver could also be hired if one wishes to bargain with the driver's guild, the ancient equivalent of the Teamsters Union. So I don't know about that. But riding a donkey was cheaper and might have been more comfortable. Roman carriages had no springs. The passengers felt every joint on the road. And so the Romans never developed an effective axle grease. There was always complaints about squeaking wagon wheels, and frequent in that of the literature of the first century. During chariot races, slaves stood along the edge of the track, tossed water on the wheels to cool them down. The most comfortable way to travel without walking was to be carried in a litter. And so in town, this chair or bed with poles on the side was carried by slaves, and on the open road, donkeys were sometimes used to carry them. In the book, also, there's a model of a Roman grain ship. And you can notice the captain's cabin on that ship. Travelers needed some kind of vehicle because they had to bring their own supplies, the food and the water. As well as they traveled, they had to have, utensils, clothes, and whatever necessities. Excuse me.
Bless you.
I'll leave that out. And so Jesus had counseled when he sent out the disciples, and also even like with 70, when we read Romans 9 and Romans 10. And he would tell them, when you go out, you go without a bag or without bread or without money. They would have sounded like madness to his contemporaries. But Cicero's brother, Quintus, turned back when the two of them were making their last effort to escape the death of Antony's soldiers, because in their haste, neither of them brought any money. Quintus knew they couldn't go anywhere or survive long, so he went back to see what resources he could scrape together, even though soldiers were pursuing him. He went back, according to Plutarch. So despite all their efforts to make travel from place to place comfortable, the Romans still had to contend with the weather like we do. So they tried as much as possible to limit their traveling to warmer months. May to October, snow was not a problem in Greece and Asia Minor, except in the higher elevations. And so in Italy, the Apennine Mountains, which divided the peninsula lengthwise like a spine, do retain their snow cover at the highest levels until late June. But all over the Mediterranean basin, rain and cold weather simply made a miserable combination for that of travel. And when we were in training, and when you was in boot camp, places like that, and you travel, most of the time you travel by foot. When it rained, sleet, or snow, you kept traveling by foot. I do recall, I went in April and May at Fort Benning, and I remember it had to be in May, because we were out firing range and doing that low crawling in the mud and rain, and it had been pouring down rain with us, and we always walked just about everywhere we went. But that night they sent somebody out and got us because it had turned very cold, and they brought trucks out and got us. And so you had to travel and stuff like that. And so Paul clearly had land travel in mind when he told the Corinthians, I intend to pass through Macedonia, and perhaps I will stay with you or even spend the winter, 1 Corinthians 16, 5 and 6. In two other passages, it's unclear whether he was concerned about land travel or sailing. In 2 Timothy 4 and verse 21, he urged Timothy, do your best to come before winter. And also in Titus 3 and verse 12, he announces his plan to spend the winter in Nicopolis, I'm sorry, I'll get it in a minute, and on the Adriatic Sea. So in each case, it's clear that travel of all sort came to a virtual halt during the winter. And that's still true in some places of the world today, even though we have all the modern things we have. There was sea travel, and that's what I like about reading the latter part of the book of Acts when Paul's on his way to Rome, because they go by sea. And I guess everything that could happen, happened. But unlike the Greeks, now again, when we study, we finished up our biblical archaeology class at Fayetteville, and back during the Old Testament times, they had the sea people. That's what they called them, because they did more of their travel by sea. And so they did, and they had pirates. They had pirates too, I guess, but pirates and so forth. But the Romans and the Jews did not take kindly to travel by sea. Cicero was trying to escape soldiers coming to put him to death, and set out in a small boat, the story goes, according to Plutarch. But the waves began to make him sick, so he ordered the boat turned around, and he went back ashore. And Seneca relates an almost comical incident when he tried to sail across the Bay of Naples instead of following the coastline, as any sensible sailor of the day would do. With no compass or other navigational aid, one could quickly become lost if out of sight of the land. And so a storm caught Seneca in the midst of the bay. He begged to be taken back to the land. The helmsman told him if it was more danger to try to get close to the shore in the storm than it was to ride it out on the open water. So Seneca ordered the man to turn from shore, no matter what the risk. And as soon as he could see they were getting close, he leaped into the water and swam the rest of the way. So he wanted to get on land. But I had this fishing person that I go fishing with, and we went fishing up on Altoona, and the fog came in while we were there. We got ready to leave, and we got moving. When we went around a bend, there was some fog, and I asked him, "Uh-oh." He said, "I don't worry." No, he said, "I don't worry about it. I know where we are." And he went right to the place where we were. It's fog everywhere. And I said, how'd you do that? And he said, "I watched the coastline. I mean, the line of the water." And he knew, because when he got over there was the dam, and he knew we was on the other side of the dam. He just went right straight across over there. And so you have to know where you are. But once the empire, that is the Roman Empire, encircled the Mediterranean Sea, the Romans had to come to terms with the water. What are we going to do? So they learned much from the Greeks about building and handling ships, and improved on their techniques to construct vessels and larger than anything that floated until the 19th century. These ships were empowered by sail and by wind, and ships were oars. Now, I want y'all to get used to this, because that's what we're going to have to get used to according to 12 years of that. Ships were with oars, and sometimes several banks of oars were normally used for military purpose, and the oars would have been used for short periods when the wind was slack, or in a situation such as ramming another ship where speed was essential, and we still are not quite certain how the oars were arranged or manipulated. Now, I remember watching a movie, The Three Stooges and Hercules, and they try to portray the man who was playing Hercules all during that. They didn't show his muscles and everything. He had on just like plain clothing. But because he was working in that thing with those oars and everything, he got big and strong. And, but that's the type of ship that they were showing in that movie. And I'd seen things like that before where they were rowing. But in biblical archaeology, when you go back and look on stones and everything, on some of the writings on the walls and the writings on stones, they have them people, that's what they are doing. You can see them rowing. There are pictures of them doing that. That's the way they would go from place to place. And so they would go from place to place that way. The more common vessels, however, were merchant ships. Now, that gets us to Acts chapter 27. If you want to go over to Acts 27, they're on this merchant ship. Now, Brother Ferguson, in his book, also deals with Acts 27, Acts 28. But Bale does also. They would get on these merchant ships. And so in those merchant ships, they transported great large quantities of grain and other commodities to feed the constant gap in all of the city of Rome. Now, shipping huge quantities of grain by water, whatever the distance, was always cheaper in the first century there than hauling carloads of passengers had to find a ship or cartloads of grain over land. So there was no regular sailing schedule. So here's passengers. Now, get the idea that here's this merchant ship getting ready to leave, and here is Paul, who has appealed to Caesar, and since he's a Roman citizen, they've got to get him to Rome. So there it was. These passengers had to find a ship going in the right direction, both passage and wait until conditions, winds, or the omens were right for sailing. Being extremely superstitious now. We have to remember that they probably had a god for that. The Romans placed great trust in dreams and omens, and if a passenger or a sailor had a premonition, that is, about misfortune, the voyage would be delayed. So the centurion and the captain on Paul's ship probably would have paid attention to the apostles' warning if they had not been desperate for a safe harbor in which to spend the winter. In Acts 27 there, verses 10 and 11, what? Verse 9. Acts 27, 9. Now, when much time was spent and when sailing was now dangerous because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the laden in the ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than the things which were spoken by Paul. And what happened? Drop down to verse 37. We'll look at it in just a few moments. So once they're on board of this ship and the passengers found no facilities for them, only the captain had a separate sleeping area. The passengers, like the crew, had to claim space on the open deck, perhaps with a small tent to keep the wind and salt spray off. They had to bring their own food, and servants had to prepare it for them. And if they were wealthy enough, they would have servants. the number of people who might buy a passage on a freighter was limited only by the boat's size and the willingness of the people to crowd together. One vessel sailed with 600 passengers. So when Paul sailed to Rome, there was 276, according to Acts 27 and verse 37. It says there, and we were in all in the ship 216 souls. So they had 276 people aboard. Now, since they had no reliable navigational aids, ships were usually stopped at dark and pulling into a river mouth or beaching on the shore. The passengers could replenish their supplies of that fresh water and forage for whatever food the area might offer. So this image was familiar enough that Epictetus readers could recognize the scene. Here he says, just as on a sea voyage, when the ship rests anchor, if you're ashore to draw water, your thoughts must be focused on the ship so that you will hear the captains when he calls. Steve, Rita, did they have a white car? Did they have a white van?
Did who have a white van?
The people
Do
that
they?
are talking about stuff.
I have no idea.
There's a Toyota white van just pulled up out there.
Are there two gentlemen in it?
Well, they opened the door. I can't see that good. You know, there's one man. If the man's driving, then it's two men. One of them, yeah, that's who it looks like. Are they just going to drop stuff off, or somebody needs to go out there?
No, they're just supposed to put it inside the door. So it should
Oh,
be
okay.
good. Thank you.
All right. So here it was sea travel in the first century. He says antiquity, but I say the first century was totally dependent on the weather. With only one large square small mountain perpendicular to the keel, Roman sailors could not tack the way a modern sailboat can, and so found it extremely difficult to sail against unfavorable winds. And so the prevailing winds blowing out of the north, for example, made it easy voyage from Asia Minor to Alexandria, but a laborious 2-month journey going the other way. Pliny tried to sail north along the coast of Asia Minor, but finally had to abandon the effort and settle for land transportation. Now, if you go to Acts chapter 27, verses 4 through 7, that same wind delayed Paul's ship. He says there, beginning verse 4, and when we had launched from thence, we sailed to Cyprus. Now, Cyprus is the home of Barnabas now, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the Sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. And when we had sailed slowly many days, notice he said slowly many days. That might be a good word to look up. I may do that. And scarce were come over against us, Smitus. The wind not suffering us, we sailed unto Crete over against Salmone. And so the time required for a voyage between any 2 points could vary from trip to trip. You know, there's no way they say, hey, we're going to leave here at 9 o'clock, get you there by 9 o'clock tomorrow. There's no way they could do that because they had to be determined by that of the wind. So we have records indicating that the trip from Puteoli, that was near Naples, to Alexandria could take some 9 to 27 days to get there by ship. So winter was the ancient sailors' dread, which we see here because of the winter that's coming. And so only in an extreme need did a ship put out to sea between October and May. The ship on which Paul was on now started the last leg of the journey to Rome was Alexandrian, and the captain was frustrated by battles against the winds. And seeing the end of the sailing season upon him, he had already given up hope of reaching Rome and knew he had to get a suitable harbor to spend the winter. Verse 12 there in chapter 27, and because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence, if by any means they might attain to Phoenix and there to winter, which is a haven of Crete and life towards the southwest and northwest. And so he would need a place that could supply lodging and food for a sizable 276 people, contingents of people, as well as a safe berth for the ship. And so the Bible, starting in verse 39 of chapter 27, points out to us, he says, and when it was day, they knew not the land. In other words, they had lightened the ship and everything and wrecked. They discovered a certain creek with a shore into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust into the ship. And when they had taken up the anchors and committed themselves into the sea and loosed the rudder bands and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind and made toward shore, and falling into a place where two seas meet, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the balance of the waves. And the soldiers counseled was to kill the prisoner, lest any of them should swim out and escape. Now, the reason for that was if they escaped that way, then they're going to lose their life anyway. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that they could swim, should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest should you go on boards or some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass they escaped all safe to the land. It's good lessons in there to preach on. But this was a frequent hazard of sea travel. So Paul reports that he was shipwrecked 3 times, 2 Corinthians 11, verse 25. This is one of the times. Now, loss of cargo was common and could mean financial ruin. But because of the risk, profits were high, and the import business was one of the quickest paths to enormous wealth, according to Petronius. So travel in the New Testament times was safer than it had ever been or would be again until the 20th century. And yet it was filled with peril, whether one undertook a short overland journey like the one from Jerusalem to Jericho, or a sea voyage halfway across the Mediterranean. Paul's decision to travel and spread the gospel involved a great more inconvenience and personal danger than we can possibly imagine in our age of jet planes and interstate highways and things of that sort. When we see the conditions under which these people labored to accomplish something that we take for granted, this should help us appreciate their achievement even more. And it might also challenge us to use our advantages to the full. I have probably anywhere from 500 to 1,000 preachers, and probably 500 of them so are overseas preachers. And a lot of times they send pictures, or they did. I got them to quit sending pictures, and because it takes up your space and so forth. And so, but they tell about, and I tell them send pictures on Facebook, not on Messenger. And I send them on Facebook, it's fine. But they'll send those, and sometimes they'll send them to them by email, and you look at those things. Brother Jim Waldron sometimes, or used to, where he works now in India, it's got more modernized, I guess. And so it's not as bad in some places, but they'll send pictures back about how they have to travel, how they have to live and so forth. Just recently, I won't say either last night or today, I was looking at a picture, and it was just like a house, shack. And I said, I wonder what kind of floor they had in it. And this is the first time I've ever really seen this. But if I'm going to get my New Testament, this is y'all see that? This is the floor of the house. And that Bible there is the outside. You see the step up? How you have to step up? Well, that's what their floors were like. And I looked and I said, well, I know why. Because that's where it wasn't well, I don't know. It wasn't that way in Vietnam either, because they just built theirs on top of the ground. But it's that way to keep the rain and water out. But that's the first time the woman was standing at the door, and you could see it. It was just as pretty round, like somebody had taken a piece of wood, and you know how you mold a piece of wood. That's the way that front of that house looked in reference to that, the flooring in that house. And so they had that. But in Vietnam, they would also not only have a flooring, but they'd also have a bunker within their house. There are numerous scenes when we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Not so in the rest of the Bible, but especially Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, scenes in the gospel that took place near the Sea of Galilee. And actually, the sea was only a good shape, like pear-shaped lake, 13 miles long and 7 miles wide. That's actually like a 64 square miles. Therefore, it was smaller than many American lakes, especially some of those in New York and Minnesota. And yet, but fishing was one of the most extremely profitable on the lake, and formed the basis of economy of towns such as Capernaum, Bethsaida, and other places. And so the fishing business there was different from what modern Bible students imagine. Individuals just didn't go out fishing and sell their catch to some processor. The local ruler during Jesus' ministry was that of Herod Antipas. He controlled the sea, the harbors, the fishing rights, and roads and bridges over which the catch traveled. They sold their rights to the brokers, the New Testament tax collectors or publicans who contracted with that of the fishermen. Now, Matthew, Levi, evidently was one of those publicans or contractors, and Zebedee was a fisher with two working sons, James and John, and hired laborers. And fishing families sometimes form collective, or as we would say, cooperatives to bid for fishing contracts or leases. And so you have Peter and Andrew, James, and John with their fathers seem to have some form of a cooperative to fish, according to Matthew 4:21 and Luke 5, verse 10. The common mode of fishing appears to have been with nets made of flax. Now, I have never seen someone fish that way. Now, I have seen people catch fish with fish nets, with just the one thing where you pull your fish in and you fish them. I've seen them take those and put them down in the water and come up and catch fish, not just take them off the hook, like that. And but I've never seen anybody pull them in like I've seen pictures on the TV where they catch all those big fish. And so the fishermen, not only that, but they made their nets, and they mended them. They washed them and they dried them. And the casting net was cast from a boat or along the shoreline, Matthew 4:18, and then a larger drag net was also cast from a boat, Matthew 13, verse 47. So there was a picture in chapter 1 of this book, an ancient fishing boat dating to the New Testament period, and was found in the mud just north of Magdala in 1986. And it was 26.5 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, 4.5 feet deep, and was made of cedar and oak. Now, clearly, Peter, Andrew, James, and John used this type of boat, and it could hold a crew of at least 5. That'd be 4 oarsmen and a tillerman, and a substantial catch of fish. And so that was one of their things. And then another thing that they did to make a living was that of farm work. In a good year, among them, the rains began to fall in October, early and former rains, and continue intermittently until April or March. March and April rains are usually latter and known as latter or spring rains. Sometimes the rainy season does not start until January, but continually adequate until April. And so the average, they say the annual rainfall on the seacoast of Mount Carmel is 26 inches. And at Gaza, 16 inches. So in the hills of Nazareth, it is 26 inches. And in Jerusalem, it's 22 inches. And at Hebron, 19 inches. And in the Jordan River, or Jordan Valley, it is only 12 inches at Beth Shean and 5 inches at Jericho. And so during those rainy seasons, then the Jordan River would go out of its banks because of all the drainage and so forth. The two most important grains that they had were wheat and barley. So wheat grew best in the coastal plains and valley, and barley, the common food of the poor, was normally grown on the poorest soil. So it was fed to the horses and the donkeys and the cattle. Jesus fed 5,000 with barley bread, John chapter 6, verse 9. The writer tells us, he says, unfortunately, that Bible versions and commentators often speak of growing of corn in Palestine. Now, corn is an Old English generic term for grain and should not be confused with the maize of the New World, which Europeans only began using after the Spanish discovered America. Wheat sowing took place in November and December, and the harvest between April and June. Barley sowing occurred around the same time as wheat, but it ripened about a month earlier, so in March and April. During the New Testament times, farmers commonly sowed and plowed at the same time. Seed was plowed into the soil. Oxen and donkeys pulled the plows and covered the seed scattered on the ground. Alternatively, the grain was plowed first and then sown. I don't know about you, but again, I was born in 1948, and I know when we were 9 years old, I don't remember having we probably did have gardens at the other place we lived across the street, but when we turned 9, we moved across up on the hill, And we would have somebody come and plow our garden, and they used a mule. And then eventually we had the man there in Cartersville that had the base station, gasoline station. He went out and bought a blue Ford tractor. And he would drive down Etowah Drive and plow your garden. I think it was $5 or $10. But he knew that we didn't have money, so he would just come in and whatever my mother could pay him, he'd plow our garden for us. So we wouldn't have to get a mule to come up there to do it. So at harvest time, farmers cut the grain with a sickle. During the Roman period, the sickle was a handheld crescent-shaped tool made of iron that had a sharp inner cutting edge, and they have found those. Today we use sickles very similar to it for a number of yard chores. They then tied the grain into bundles and loaded them onto donkeys or carts and took them to the threshing floor, a hard surface of soil or stone, and there they might beat the grain to separate from the straw, or they drove oxen around and around to do the same. And so often they used threshing sleds for large quantities of grain, and there were wooden platforms and stones attached underneath that would drag over the grain, but by oxen or by donkey. And so last came the winnowing process. On the breezy days, the farmers used 5-pronged windling forks to throw the grain and the straw in the air, and the wind blew away the shaft. Psalm 1 verse 4, or the straw, and the grain fell back to the ground. And that's the last part of the process. The harvester used wooden shovels to toss up the grain. And finally, they used a sieve to sift impurities from the grain. So this was ready to be stored once they got all that done. And so there are reference to that of barns, in Matthew 6, Matthew 13, and Luke 12 especially, is misleading. Thus, probably the average Bible reader thinks of a large red barn on a farm in rural America, but what is in view here is simply a place for storing grain. The archaeological excavations that we see, we know that granaries may have been clay jars, pitted, lined with plaster or brick, or brick silos, beehive shaped with vents at the top. And so in addition, with that of the wheat and barley, the Palestinian farmers in the New Testament times grew millet, and spelt, and oats, and rye. Generally, Palestine had enough grain for its own needs, and even some to export. For example, in the days of Herod Agrippa I, Tyre and Sidon depended on the king's country, that is Judea, for foodstuff, according to Acts 12 and verse 20. Though most agricultural was dry farming during the New Testament times, they also practiced irrigation, especially in the Jordan Valley and around Jericho. So they tapped the water of rivers and springs and wells and sent it by means of pipes, aqueduct, and man-made channels to the thirsty fields. And so again, a lot of things that we think that, where did we come up with this idea? These people had come up with those kind of ideas years ago. And then there's also, as we find, according to John 10, about sheep. Any family in Palestine might have a few sheep, but large flocks required full-time shepherds and probably some hired hands. It's like you go here in Georgia and you see chicken houses. We had chickens when I was growing up, but we didn't have not over 12. Got up that big, we killed them and ate them. But we didn't keep a lot. But shepherds often cared for sheep of a whole village. And so after spring rains, there would be plenty of pasturage. And after the harvest, sheep could eat the remains of the wheat and the oats and the rye that was left in the field. And so thereafter, shepherds had to take their flocks in search of dry grass or remaining patches of green grass. And so the shepherd had to care for his sheep at all times, providing them with food, water, and protection. Jesus called himself the Good Shepherd, John 10:11. In protecting the sheep, he gave his life for the sheep, as the shepherd might have to do in battling with animals, John 10:11 and 15. He is a true shepherd. He, as the true shepherd, did not, as hired man, flee when the sheep were attacked by wild animals, John 10 and verse 12. In the words of Psalm 23 and verse 4, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So the rod or the club and the sling protected the sheep from harm. And so The shepherd used his staff or walking stick to control the sheep and to count them as they entered into the gate to make sure that he still had the same amount that he had before they were let out or carried out. When a sheep got lost, according to Luke 15:3-6, the shepherd would go out and search for it. And when he found the lost or the sick sheep, he sometimes tenderly cared for it, carried it on his shoulders. And at night, the shepherd kept watch over the sheep in the fields as the shepherd did on the earth, or at the birth of that of Jesus at near Bethlehem. A sheepfold are preferable to the open fields. However, a fold could be a cave or a stone enclosure, and the shepherd would lie down across the opening, the door of the sheep, John 10:7. In fact, the shepherd had such an intimate relationship with his sheep that they knew him, followed him, and responded to his voice. And they would not follow strangers. Now, this is my understanding of what they mean there. And this has been illustrated in many places where people had sheep. They could take, we'll say, 100 sheep and put them out there. And that we'll say, for instance, they took 10 sheep from 10 men's fold, and they put them all together. And they could get the man to get up and call, and his 10 sheep would come to him. And they would all divide and go to their master or the shepherd, because they knew his voice. And so that's the idea. They would not follow a stranger. They had other animals besides that of sheep. The farmers raised other animals for food and for sacrifices during the New Testament. Cattle had been raised in significant numbers from the first century. Also has had turtle doves and pigeons, and hens and roosters were introduced abroad from the east about the time of Christ. The hunting of wild animals for food assumed less and less significance during the first century. And fishing around the Sea of Galilee provided the basic economy, as we said, for several towns. And so those who profited from the industry included the fishermen who caught the fish, and those who processed the fish, and those who marketed the fish. So there's three separate groups. So the fish had to be pickled, salted, or dried in order to preserve or transport it. And so processed fish was distributed to merchants throughout Palestine by ships. And so the ship containers were large clay jars, they called them. When you go into a town, what they did, that is the industry, their culture, the Jewish culture, expected every father to teach his son a craft. Joseph was a carpenter, so Jesus was the son of a carpenter, so most likely he was a carpenter. And that's what we always say. Whether in Jerusalem or elsewhere in Judaism, the list of crafts practiced in the cities is long indeed, and included tailors and cobblers and masons and stone cutters and woodcutters, woodworkers and carpenters and bakers and tanners and perfumers, butchers and cooks and cheesemakers and barbers and launderers, and men and women, smiths. I married one of those, Linda Smith, in gold and silver and copper and iron, dyers, linen weavers and carpet weavers and embroiderers and potters and glassmakers and doctors and scribes and more. In other words, they had the same kind of people we did. And it's amazing when you read that, because when you go through there and read that, to me, he talks about weavers and carpet weavers, linen weavers and carpet weavers. I worked for a carpet mill, and it's very interesting to watch them make that. Then I worked for a factory that made T-shirts and briefs for men. And that was something, because they also made the material in that same building. And so it was interesting to watch them. So workers engaged in the same crafts tended to live together in one section of the city, and there is some evidence that they also developed rudimentary guild organizations among themselves. The masons, stonecutters, and woodworkers had plenty to do in Jerusalem during the days of Herod, because Herod the Great rebuilt the temple in 20 BC to AD 64. And so his palace with the three adjacent towers of Hippicus and Phasael and Marietta, when we were studying biblical archaeology at Fayetteville, we have a map of this area of Herod's the Great Temple, and it shows all these areas, and you can find those online. Also, the fortress of Antonia north of the temple, a theater, hippodrome, among other things. Herod Agrippa I, 41 to 44, built the northmost wall of the city, 2 miles long. After completion of the temple, about 18,000 workers were unemployed, and conditions in and around Jerusalem grew a little tense. In order to relieve that situation, Agrippa II had Jerusalem paved with white stone, probably limestone. But this was only a temporary solution. So Agrippa, in cooperation with the high priest, began a new construction at the site of the temple about 66. And this too was only partially successful in reducing unemployment. And so increasingly unemployment, a general worsened economy, heavy taxes, and unwise administrative acts of prefects, of the procurators, tended to radicalize the lower class of Jerusalem area and made them supportive of revolt against that of Rome. And when it came in 66, fall. James tells us in James 4 and verse 13, he says, today or tomorrow we'll go into such and such a city and spend a year there, buy and sell and make profit. And Mark 12 verse 38, we find it says there, beware of the scribes who love greetings in the marketplace. And then also Luke 10:30, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves. So there's a big problem there when we stop and think about the commerce. The New Testament times, Palestine had experienced extensive urbanization. And so in addition to Jerusalem and the city of Decapolis and other towns with large populations, including Caesarea, Samaria, and Hebron, and Bethlehem, and Lydia, and Jana, Tiberias, and other places, this is significant because they provided a market for agricultural goods from their hitherlands and developed town industries in reference to that. And the aristocratic classes, they wanted this luxury and all these goods from home and abroad, and a large part of the foreign trade to the Jews. Excuse me. The Jewish majority, they had fairs in different places. They were held connected with pagan religious festivities also. And at these, one could buy all of the kinds of foreign goods of the itinerant salesman. And of course, the pilgrims spent large sums of money in Jerusalem and so on. And so the Jewish mariners learned the ways of the sea, and Jewish boats sailed off from different places. And so we find that the different places were, even to Greece and to Antioch and elsewhere, and the foreign vessels in considerable numbers were put in those ports. Okay, we have finished this book. And so we will, any questions? If we study from the book, we'll talk about Syria as a cradle for the church. And that'll be taken from Acts chapter 11. It's actually what I have done in case we don't study the other thing that I mentioned. That looking at some of the areas where the church was and see what was taking place at that time. That was also deals with putting together what we have learned in reference to the manners and the customs. Any questions?
When is the final?
No, we got 4 more weeks.
Okay, good.
See, 18th, the 25th, the 2nd, no, 4 weeks.
Okay,
So 8 more hours.
all right.
I only have 1 class at Fayetteville. It's over next week. That's a long drive. That's nearly 8 hours.
Yep.
From beginning to get back home. Here it's 35 minutes, 45 minutes. It's traffic.
That's still a drive.
Huh?
That's still a drive.
Yeah, well, it's just 23, 25. Well, I think I told him it's a 60-mile round trip. When they talk about mileage and so forth. So you got 60 miles from here to my house. And I live off of about 5 miles from the interstate. I think it's 5 miles. Okay. Y'all have a good weekend.
Good, Bobby.
All right. Y'all have a good weekend.
Night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Sunday, Bobby.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that was my people in the white van.
Okay.
They dropped it off. So if there's just a box inside the door, it should be fine.
Okay. We're not supposed to go in and eat anything out of it?
Well, you can, but I think it's just papers.
Oh. Well, we're not be able to go, so we won't be eating that. All right. Y'all have a good week.
Thanks, Bobby.
Bye.
Good night. Let me see.